The Villain Press presents A Fatal Steeping, an Emma Warwick Mystery short story written by Amelia D. Read to you by Beth, an AI synthetic female voice. Chapter 1. A Stormy Brew. Thick grey clouds loomed as Emma Warwick hobbled along the cobblestones of the pedestrian North Parade Passage in the city of Bath. The scent of impending rain hung heavy in the air like nature's warning bell, earthy and electric. She breathed in that telltale metallic tang as she ambled along the historic lane. Slipping her hand inside the pockets of her long black wrap coat, she hunched over as a light autumn breeze with a slight icy chill blew through the passageway. Fairy lights were strung up in a zigzag pattern between the two-storey Georgian facades on either side of the narrow passageway. They were tied to the posts of the black shop signs hanging above the open shop doors near the first-floor windows. Each shop had a large bay window on the ground level. The trim of the bay windows was painted the same colour as the doors. A large lamppost, powered by oil during the Georgian period but converted to electricity for the modern era, stood in the middle of the walkway. The street still looked distinctly Georgian, apart from the handful of smartphone-wielding tourists with backpacks. Her black patent leather ballerinas, with their 3-centimetre block heels and French librarian charm, clacked against the cobblestones. Pain shot from her left heel up her leg. The expensive shoes sparked fresh regret. The 310-quid splurge demanded proper breaking in, not a hasty morning rush from her London flat, followed by inner-city errands before she caught the Bath train. Even though the shoes caused her pain, she loved them for one simple reason. She had purchased them and a host of other designer items on her soon-to-be ex-husband, Stephen Sinclair's black Amex, immediately after she'd caught him having a meeting in his office with the new head of human resources. The designer shopping spree, which included an electric car due to be delivered before Christmas, had helped take Emma's mind off the shock, but only for a split second. Reality soon found her, and a deep sadness set in once more. Perhaps for all time, Emma would have seared into her retinas an image of the new head of human resources with her legs wrapped around Stephen's waist. That was Stephen's idea of a meeting. By the time Emma got down to the foyer of Byte Tech's office in St Pancras, she had discovered that Stephen had scheduled a meeting with that 20-something leggy thing that fateful Sunday in October, all thanks to his company-facing calendar. He started it as an initiative to promote transparency among executive-level staff members. But that wasn't the only horrifying thing she'd discovered. That cheeky so-and-so had scheduled the head of HR for multiple meetings. Those meetings had started in September. And what happened in September? He hired her. That hiring was a 5-by-3-foot red flag waving in a cyclone directly in front of her face. But she'd ignored it because she was too busy holding design review meetings for the next software update. The 20-something leggy thing was relatively fresh out of university, had less than a year's experience with a leading tech company, and fluttered her eyelashes like a hummingbird with hay fever. Thanks to his stupidity, Emma had known every time he cheated on her. What a sly fox! As she reached the intersection where the North Parade Passage flowed onto Church Street, a tiny droplet of water fell from the sky and hit her cheek. Emma groaned as she recalled leaving her black-spotted umbrella on the bench in the hall opposite her front door. Worst of all, her wool cashmere blend wrap coat had no hood and was unsuitable for the rain. It was dry clean only. Taking the hint from the grey clouds, Emma picked up her pace and scurried along Church Street. She followed the pedestrian street past the Abbey Green, which was more of a cobblestone square and looked nothing like a garden, and into Abbey Street. It was already 33 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, and she was late. A second rain droplet hit the top of her newly washed, cut, and dyed long dark brown hair that she'd had styled at a nearby salon. The blowout had cost Emma an extra £30 on top of all the other services she'd had over a 3-hour period. It cost her a fortune. Thanks to the incoming rain, her money was moments away from being washed down the drain. As she turned the corner, Emma smiled at the Georgian Leaf Tea Room's pale blue and white sign as it swayed in the strengthening breeze. That was not good news. Dashing down the street, Emma spotted a Christmas garland laden with red, bottle green and gold baubles and smiled. It was the 4th of November, and a certain someone had already decorated for Christmas. Emma ran her fingers along the weathered stone facade. The townhouse was frozen between eras, much like herself, a modern woman trapped in the aftermath of a period drama-style betrayal. At least those walls had survived their transitions with grace. Hopefully, she could do the same. Chapter 2. Trouble be brewing. Rain lashed against the windows of the Georgian Leaf Tea Room. Emma stood in the entry hall, sheltered by soaring ceilings and ornate plasterwork that spoke of Georgian craftsmanship. The doors on the right were closed, but it was a Friday. Perhaps that was typical because it was her first time visiting on a weekday. Her once-a-month meet-up with that sly fox's younger sister Violet usually occurred on the first Saturday of the month, and she was already 6 minutes late. Hopefully, Violet was too busy to notice. Her soon-to-be ex-sister-in-law had been adamant about meeting that day. Violet had insisted, over text, that family emergencies don't wait for weekends. Despite Emma's many attempts to learn more details, Violet had refused to elaborate. The more paranoid part of Emma's mind couldn't help suspecting that more bad news about Stephen was coming her way. Outside, the rain beat down on the cobblestones as tourists ducked for cover in nearby shops, pubs and museums. In mere seconds, 2 droplets had become something torrential. She breathed in the comforting aroma of freshly brewed tea leaves, pastries, fresh cream, cakes, and a hint of strawberry that permeated the ground floor of the historic townhouse. Emma could feel herself putting on a few extra pounds while breathing in the aroma. For the first time since October, she cared about potential weight gain. Like a rat following the tune of the Pied Piper, she followed the scent through the open French doors into the tea room. She stood at the white timber counter at the front of the room. Pausing, she gazed up at the rows of teapots and cups on the shelves of the corner wall-mounted unit next to the 2 large Georgian-style windows that gave natural light to the front half of the tea room. Behind her, somewhere beyond the entrance hall, a door slammed shut. Heavy footsteps shook the floor as Emma surveyed the left-hand side of the ground-floor tea room. Only 3 customers were in the shop. Mrs. Peggy Bradford, a short, thin woman in her mid-70s, sat in her usual spot by the display cabinet. Her hair was cut into a shoulder-length grey bob with a fringe, and it took years off her face. Peggy had draped her beige parka over the back of her chair, another unusual sighting at the Georgian Leaf. Violet preferred that the staff hang the customers' coats in the closet to avoid space issues between the tables. Peggy tugged at the collar of her dark orange turtleneck sweater as she gazed up at the teapots, cups, saucers, and milk jugs with vintage blue Asiatic pheasants patterns that lined the cabinet's glass shelves. With a smile, Peggy turned to her table and cleared away the cutlery, leaving a large space in front of her. Mrs. Bradford must have ordered something different from her usual pot of Earl Grey and a slice of carrot cake. At the end of the tea room, a man with a David Beckham-inspired buzz cut sat at a table by the window. Close to his table were the stairs leading to the basement level, which had more seating. He wore a 3-piece black suit and grey waistcoat, and what appeared to be the chain of a pocket watch hung from his pocket. The man seemed overdressed for a tea room, from his shiny cufflinks to his polished black Oxfords, which gave a bespoke vibe. A wild, frantic expression flashed across his face like that of a runaway groom. It was highly unlikely that couples would marry on a Friday afternoon, so maybe he was just overdressed. The man stared out the window at the street behind the townhouse with his smartphone pressed to his ear, but he said nothing. He pulled a gold pocket watch out of the pocket in his waistcoat, flipped it open, closed it, then slipped it back. Maybe he had a meeting. "Don't worry, I'll talk to the residents. The project is full steam ahead," the man stage whispered. Sitting at the table next to the banister was a woman with long, dark blonde hair with highlights. She wore thick black square-framed spectacles and was dressed in all black. As she bent over a thin silver laptop, her eyes darted across the screen. The movement of her eyes seemed unnatural, as if she were pretending to read. She might have been listening to the runaway groom's conversation or a conversation in the basement. "Emma, dear," Peggy called out from across the room as she waved. Emma smiled. Every time she visited the Georgian Leaf, Peggy was in attendance, as if she was slowly moving into the townhouse, one afternoon, tea at a time. There was no escaping her. After wandering across the room, Emma asked, "Are you well, Mrs. Bradford?" She decided to ask a safe question and not mention the new hairstyle to avoid a long conversation. A wave of guilt swept over her. Peggy was probably lonely and desperate for company, and there Emma was, taking steps to avoid her. Peggy leaned in. "Dear, I'm getting the high tea just for today. I've worked up quite the appetite." Her gaze moved up over Emma's shoulder, then she assessed the tea room. "Be careful," she whispered. "Foul things are afoot." A lump formed in the pit of Emma's stomach. It seemed as if Mrs. Bradford was growing paranoid in her old age. Emma had known Violet since she was a teenager. Violet wouldn't get mixed up in anything remotely dodgy. Then again, when Emma and that sly fox had first gotten married, she would have never envisioned he would one day betray her. So she couldn't trust her own judgment. Still, the mere idea of Violet getting involved in something shady seemed ridiculous. "What do you mean?" Emma inched closer to the table. "Jenny, you're just in time," Peggy exclaimed. Emma turned around. Before her was a young woman whose delicate features seemed almost doll-like, pale porcelain skin, expressive brown eyes beneath hooded lids, and straight jet-black hair that framed her face perfectly. Jenny's shoulders stiffened as if she was bracing for criticism. In her hands was a three-tiered cake stand. A gold post ran through the middle of each plate. At the top of the pole was a handle, which she gripped with intensity, her knuckles turning white. Sandwiches, scones, cream, jam, and mini-cakes filled the stand. With a napkin in her trembling right hand, Jenny gripped a pale blue and white spotted teapot that matched the cake stand, causing the china to rattle ever so slightly. She seemed too young to be working. Perhaps Peggy believed Violet was hiring children to work at the tea room. That might explain why she said that foul things were afoot. Peggy scanned the tea room as if expecting to find someone eavesdropping. Emma took a few steps back as Jenny set up Peggy's table for high tea. Glancing around the room, Emma spotted a clean table for 4 opposite the fireplace. The table was close to the long white wooden counter near the double doors to the entrance hall. It was the perfect location for Violet to spot Emma as she entered. Thankful for the opportunity to be off her feet, Emma sat. Jenny scurried towards the entrance hall. As she left, Jenny shook her wrist and glanced down. The round screen of her smartwatch lit up, revealing the time. The woman, dressed in all black, picked up her smartphone. Flicking her long blonde hair over her shoulder, the woman took several photos of the room. Lowering her phone, she hunched over and toggled the screen with her thumb and forefinger as if zooming in on one of her shots. So she was most likely a tourist, making sure her images were perfect for social media. Maybe she was just nosy and loved eavesdropping on other people's conversations. The runaway groom got up and wandered to the white counter. As he passed by the blonde, he peered over his shoulder at her. Peggy took a sip of her tea. "Oh, bother!" The man turned and eyed Peggy. "Oh dear, would you be so kind as to get me some sugar?" Peggy pointed at the counter. "I'm sure they store it over there near the till." Peggy hated sugar in her tea. She ordered it black, with no milk and no sugar, and sent it back if it had even the slightest hint of anything sweet. Last month, she'd insisted the chef had added an artificial sweetener to her teapot of Earl Grey. Following a huge fight, she got a replacement teapot. She must be up to something. "Oh," the man paused. "I was just looking for sugar myself." Emma sensed a lie in his words, and the false note rang in her ears. He wandered to the other side of the counter and rummaged through some items concealed by the counter's customer-facing level. The man brushed his hands along the front of his waistcoat, then continued his search. With a groan, he bent down behind the counter. Standing, he swept his gaze across the room. A warmth radiated from the blue floral tablecloth as her fingers glided across its surface. It felt warm, like it had just been ironed. Dull whispers broke Emma's train of thought. Emma's eyes landed on Peggy's table, where the man was hovering over her, whispering. They seemed to be in a discussion. It wasn't a fight because the conversation didn't seem intense or angry. He straightened, then sauntered across the room, clutching the sugar bowl, and bumped into the woman with thick-framed spectacles. She glared at him, then continued her journey to the front of the tea-room with an open black bag draped over her left shoulder. Her left hand formed a fist. Around her right wrist was a square smartwatch with rounded corners. Its watch face lit up, revealing a simple analog clock. A digital boing echoed through the tea-room. Taking a sharp left turn, she marched into the entrance and froze. The woman cast her eyes around the entry hall. She turned into the tea-room and paused, looking confused as she studied the room. She marched up to Peggy's table. "Excuse me, could you point me towards the ladies?" "Oh, yes." With a trembling hand, Peggy picked up her teapot and tried to top up her cup. "Let me help you with that." She smiled. "I'm Dr. Catherine Ashford." She leaned towards Peggy. "The service is awfully slow today, isn't it?" The last name swirled around in Emma's mind. She had heard it before, but couldn't put her finger on it. Remembering things had become a little difficult of late, as if she was losing words. Her age made menopause seem unlikely, yet the symptoms aligned. Then again, she might simply recognize the name from somewhere and be judging herself too harshly as usual. Peggy grimaced. "Well, it does close a little after 4, dear." Emma caught sight of the tablecloth and bit the inside of her lip to stifle a laugh. "And the bathrooms, do you know where they are?" Catherine asked in a hushed tone. "Oh, the ladies' bathrooms are in the other tea-room." Peggy smiled. "The doors are unlocked. You can just go through. They're in the back." Catherine straightened, turned, dashed to the entrance, and disappeared into the next room. Emma traced her eyes across the fireplace's hearth, admiring the intricate carvings. Above the fireplace was a Georgian-era portrait of the original owners of the tea-room, but back then it would have simply been their home. "Emma!" a voice called out. Violet St. Clair emerged from the double French doors in a whirl of expensive perfume and a belted black shirt dress with a full skirt. With her dark blonde locks pulled back in an immaculate chignon, she floated the short distance across the room, the very picture of elegance personified. While Emma's life had crumbled like a poorly coded and tested product launch, Violet's had remained perfectly preserved. She embodied the polished world Emma was leaving, a world where she struggled to feel at home. The skirt of Violet's shirt dress swished as she glided across the floor. In her hands was a tray bearing 2 teapots and 2 cups with saucers. One of the teapots had a familiar pastel green tag attached to a string and bore the words "Green Rose Tea." That was Emma's favourite. Violet placed the tea tray on the table, then unloaded the items before setting the table for tea. After she finished, she turned, leaned over the white counter, and placed the tray on the bench, out of reach of customers. Violet pulled out the chair opposite her and sat facing the room. Emma's wool cashmere blend wrap coat suddenly felt like costume jewellery next to a family heirloom. Reaching across the table, Violet grabbed Emma's hands and gave her a sympathetic smile. "I'm so sorry, I don't know what to say." Violet shook her head as all the colour drained from her face. "I loved having you as my sister," Violet's voice broke, "and Stephen just ruined it." "Yeah," Emma sighed. "It turns out he's about as faithful as a quarterly earnings report, full of creative interpretations. We can still be friends. As a bonus, that sly fox will love that. He'll get all paranoid about what we might be discussing." Violet chuckled as she poured Emma a cup of green tea. "I think I'm going to love your ex-wife era." Outside, the sky darkened as rain thrashed against the window, thunder boomed, and lightning flashed. What Emma had hoped would be an afternoon rain shower had transitioned into a full-blown storm. It was a good thing she had a vast supply of tea at her fingertips, because knowing her luck, the storm would keep going until nightfall. The window frames rattled as thunder crackled, but that time it felt closer, like the storm was directly above the Georgian leaf tea room. Emma wrapped her hands around her teacup, seeking warmth. Catherine and the runaway groom rose from their tables, wandered to the front of the tea room, stood at the counter, and watched the storm through the front windows. A flash of lightning illuminated the tea room in stark white, casting elongated silhouettes across the period furnishings. Darkness descended, turning the tea room into a theatre of whispers and shadows. The gentle hum of the antique gas radiators fell silent, their warmth lingering like the remnants of a summer romance. The modern world had retreated, leaving them suspended in a pocket of Georgian twilight where conversations became intimate conspiracies and the aroma of tea grew stronger. It was as if the darkness had unleashed the full power of its perfume. Somewhere in the shadows, Mrs. Bradford let out a theatrical gasp. There was always one. "Don't worry, everyone," Violet called out in a calm tone. "It happens every time there's a storm. The backup generator will kick in soon." She paused, turning and staring at the right tea room's closed doors. "Jenny, fetch candles from the back room." Emma's eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. The entire street had gone dark. A historical bubble formed, cutting them off from the modern world. She was trapped in a bygone era with a collection of strangers who suddenly seemed more mysterious than they had in the light. "I'll go check up on the generator." Violet rose, wandered through the tea room, then glided down the stairs to the basement. Chapter 3. By candlelight. 10 minutes later, Emma traced the rim of her teacup with her index finger, watching the storm through the tea room's front windows. At the white wooden counter, Catherine Ashford and the man in the bespoke suit stood in place like the King's Guard at Buckingham Palace. Their shadows stretched across the polished timber floorboards with each flash of lightning. The power outage had transformed them all into reluctant players in a period drama, except for Mrs. Bradford, who remained frozen at her table. Mrs. Bradford's new bob obscured her face as she slumped forward onto the pale blue floral tablecloth. Her carefully manicured hand stretched as if reaching for something no longer present. A dark brown tie dripped from Peggy's table onto the polished timber floorboards with a rhythm that matched Emma's racing heart. The woman's petite frame was motionless, showing no signs of life. Absent were the natural rhythms associated with breathing, the subtle rise and fall of the shoulders or the rhythmic motion of the ribcage. The gasp she'd uttered earlier finally made sense. It wasn't a theatrical reaction to the power outage, but her last breath. At the end of the tea room, the sugar bowl glinted on the man's abandoned table, catching the storm's illumination like a flash from a camera at a crime scene. The sugar bowl must have been important to Mrs. Bradford's last moments, but Emma could only guess at its significance. It gnawed away at her mind like a mouse carefully nibbling cheese on a trap. Still, she had to do something. While no one else was watching, she needed to protect the evidence. Thunder rolled overhead. Emma rose from her chair, the scraping sound barely audible over the storm. She crept past Mrs. Bradford's table near the end of the tea room. Emma got to Mrs. Bradford's table, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mrs. Bradford," she whispered, though she already knew there would be no response. With trembling fingers, she reached for Peggy's wrist, searching for a pulse she desperately hoped to find. The skin was still warm, but beneath her fingertips there was only stillness. Emma swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in her throat. Just minutes ago, the woman had tried to warn her about something sinister happening in the tea room. Drawing in a shaky breath, Emma forced herself to think clearly. If Mrs. Bradford had been murdered, there would be evidence. Her gaze fell on the abandoned sugar bowl glinting at the end of the tea room. Moving as quietly as she could, she approached the table and picked up the sugar bowl with a clean napkin. Once she turned around, she sauntered to her table and sat. Leaning to the side, she placed the sugar bowl inside the fireplace's empty hearth, hiding it from public view. Sitting upright in her chair, Emma ran her finger along the rim of her teacup and waited. She wanted to observe the reactions of the tea room's other guests and staff to Mrs. Bradford's untimely death. Hidden in their reactions might lurk a clue revealing the killer. The runaway groom peered over his shoulder. "Someone should check on her," he said, making no move to do so himself. Emma fought the urge to roll her eyes. Even in crisis, the peculiar social choreography of British awkwardness held firm. "Oh." Catherine turned and looked at Peggy's table as she gripped the countertop with her right hand, her left hand resting on top of the opened flap of her shoulder bag. "She is old. Maybe she's just knackered. Rain is great if you have insomnia, and that's an old lady thing." As Emma rose from her chair, Jenny emerged from the back room. She had a brass candlestick in each hand, and the candle's flames cast an ethereal glow through the darkened tea room. As she moved from table to table, familiar objects transformed into strange silhouettes. Teapots became crouching beasts, and cups cast elongated shadows that seemed to creep across the room. Awakened by the darkness, the portraits of long-dead Georgians stared down from the walls with newfound interest. Waving the candlestick in her left hand in front of her, Jenny froze as the light reached Peggy's table. "Mrs. Bradford," Jenny's voice quavered as she reached for the motionless figure. "Wait!" Emma held out her hand. "Don't touch her." Emma's legs felt as heavy as lead as she approached Mrs. Bradford's table. Just an hour ago, the elderly woman had warned her about dangers lurking in the tea room, her eyes bright with urgency. Those eyes would never open again. Emma's hand trembled slightly as she crouched beside the motionless figure. Through the sharp tang of spilt tea, a faint bitter almond aroma lingered in the air around her body and on the tea-soaked tablecloth. Since Emma had moved into her own flat, she had developed the habit of watching a true crime docuseries on Netflix, all 8 seasons. Emma forced herself to focus past the tightness in her chest. All those hours of true crime documentaries hadn't prepared her for the reality of death up close, the absolute stillness, the way the air itself seemed heavier. But Mrs. Bradford deserved justice, not just tears. Drawing a steadying breath, Emma began cataloguing details through eyes that threatened to blur. According to the forensic expert in Season 1, cyanide had a bitter almond smell. That meant someone had poisoned her. Anyone who had access to the tea room could have easily added poison to the sugar or her tea directly, either in the kitchen or at the table. If Peggy wasn't paying attention, someone could have walked past and dropped it into her teacup. But someone who was eagle-eyed like Peggy would have noticed the damp sugar. A long, contorted shadow towered above Emma and Mrs. Bradford. its twisted silhouette added to the eeriness of the discovery. The figure sniffed loudly. A sweet, pungent aroma of ylang-ylang, rose and deep jasmine overpowered Emma's senses and drowned out all traces of the subtle, bitter almond. "Oh, that's cyanide for sure," Catherine announced matter-of-factly. "I would know. After all, I'm a historian of the early modern era, from 1500 to 1700. British history, of course." She waved dismissively. "I'm writing an academic paper on the Abbey. That's why I've brought my laptop to a tea room. You know, the Bath Abbey is only a stone's throw away." Catherine glanced around the room. In a prime central location like this, you don't see many original Georgian features preserved so well. It must be Grade 1 listed. Catherine sighed as she examined the table. Someone probably poured it into her tea. Poor thing. Emma grimaced. Catherine was a know-it-all. Worst of all, Emma was trapped in the tea room by a torrential downpour. "Perhaps you recognise me. I'm Dr. Catherine Ashford from the BBC docu-series on the Reformation." "Actually, I'm a pharmacy student from the University of Bath," Jenny snapped, "and you don't know what you're talking about. Both sodium cyanide and potassium cyanide are white powders. In particular, crystalline potassium cyanide is indistinguishable from salt or sugar." Jenny's brown eyes widened. How much cyanide would have been used? Emma cast her eyes on Mrs. Bradford. Jenny sighed. "All it takes is a 1:9 ratio mixed into the sugar bowl, and it would have taken 2 teaspoons. It's a quick-acting poison. Anyone with a credit card and an internet connection could have done this." Emma stood. So someone could have prepared the crystalline potassium cyanide earlier. Then this person could have waited for Mrs. Bradford to ask for help and seized the opportunity. After all, she was a regular and loved people waiting on her. Violet told me she was here every day except for Sunday. The predictability of her routine would have made her an easy target. A chill ran down Emma's spine as realization struck. She faced Jenny. "Earlier, Mrs. Bradford told me that something bad was happening in this tea room. I didn't take her seriously, and now she's dead." The runaway groom groaned. "This is ridiculous. Peggy was an annoying busybody, and she discovered something. That I believe. No one mixed anything into the sugar in front of us. It happened in the kitchen. Someone poured the cyanide into her teapot, as Catherine said, and it was probably Violet." The rest of the room fell silent. "She's run off and is disposing of the evidence as we speak. Notice how Peggy died a little over half an hour before closing." "Yes," Catherine chimed in, "and you probably helped her with all your so-called knowledge of poisons." Catherine pointed at Jenny. I, Jenny stammered. "I'm just a pharmacy student on a visa." "It's settled. We should call the police and have you both arrested." The runaway groom straightened. Emma sighed. "So the police are just going to take your word for it, mister. Colin Pembroke. I'm a property developer with a well-respected reputation in this town." "Oh," Emma smiled, "you don't have any evidence. All you have is a conspiracy theory and a well-connected boys' club. How dare you?" "Ah, Colin." Catherine took a few steps to her left, lengthening the gap between her and Colin. "She has a point. You don't have evidence." Colin rolled his eyes. "I don't need evidence. That's for the police to find." Somewhere in the depths of the townhouse, a door slammed. Loud thuds echoed through the ground level, growing louder as someone approached. "See? What did I tell you?" Colin pointed at the right-hand back corner of the ground floor. "Violet didn't even check on the generator. She's leaving the kitchen. I was right." "About what?" Violet asked from the entrance hall. Colin stormed across the room and into the entrance and grabbed Violet's arm before dragging her into the tea room. "I'm placing you under citizen's arrest for the murder of Peggy Bradford." "What? No, she probably just fell asleep," Violet whimpered. Her mouth fell open, and her head drew back. She wiggled free from Colin's grip and dashed to Peggy's table, then grabbed her wrist. "I guess Mrs. Bradford is a little old. She probably just had a heart attack." "Did you hear me?" Colin grabbed Violet's bicep and pulled her away from the table, then dragged her to the white counter. "I'm placing you under citizen's arrest for the murder of Peggy Bradford." "This is beyond insulting." Violet's voice shook as if she was torn between outrage and terror. "This is my family's tea room. We've served this community for generations. I would never—" Colin rolled his eyes. "You clearly poisoned her tea." "But I was in the kitchen all— The chef left early, you see, and someone had to— There were orders to fill—" Her words tumbled out, fragments of explanation competing with shock. "This has been the first lull in the afternoon. I've been busy." Tiny hairs lifted on the back of Emma's neck as a chill ran down her spine. Based on Violet's micro-expressions, she wasn't lying. Emma noted the slight tremor in her voice, the genuine shock in her eyes. She had known Violet since she was a teenager. There was no way she would do something like that. After months of watching that sly fox perfect the art of deception, Emma had developed a finely tuned radar for lying. For the first time that afternoon, her inner lie detector wasn't pinging. "We've been through this. You have no evidence. All you have is a business owner working in her kitchen after her chef left, and a customer with suspected cyanide poisoning." Emma pointed at Mrs. Bradford. "There's no autopsy or toxin screening to confirm this. We don't know how she ingested it either." "It's enough in my mind," Colin scoffed. "Well, the rest of us live in the real world, where professionals sweep crime scenes for fingerprints, conduct medical analyses, and collect evidence." Emma's brow furrowed. "I didn't do this. Emma, you believe me, right?" Violet wept. Emma smiled at Violet, hoping it would reassure her. Then she realized something. "Mr. Pembroke, how do you know Mrs. Bradford?" He sighed. "I don't." "Earlier you said that Mrs. Bradford was an annoying busybody, and she discovered something." Emma paused as Colin tensed. "But you didn't call her Mrs. Bradford. You called her Peggy. How did you know that? Because I don't recall her introducing herself to you." Catherine gasped. "She must live in one of those Georgian terraced houses you were trying to buy out and transform into a hotel." She laughed. "You're a scoundrel, Colin. I suppose it's one down. 4 more to go. Am I right?" Emma bit the inside of her lip as she recalled Mrs. Bradford and Colin's interaction over the sugar bowl. Holy crapes. "Wait, you were very interested in Mrs. Bradford's table earlier. The conversation was all hushed. You didn't introduce yourself. It was as if you were finishing a previous conversation." Colin let out an exasperated sigh. "That project isn't going ahead. The residents don't want to move, and I respect that. I do things ethically in my business, unlike others." Emma barely refrained from rolling her eyes. St. Colin, the world's first honest and ethical property developer, had graced them all with his virtuous presence. What a load of utter codswallop! "That's why you're arresting me with this citizen's arrest nonsense. You're framing me, knowing that this establishment will close during the court case, my business will go under, and you plan to swoop in with Pembroke Properties to save the day and offer me an extortionately low price." Violet blinked back her tears. "This house has been in my family for generations. Those are my ancestors on the walls. Apart from Henry VIII, of course." Colin loosened his grip on Violet's arm. The man was speechless. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. A device let out a digital boing, breaking the silence, but no one in the tea room acknowledged its existence. Everyone focused on Colin and Violet. With a thump, Jenny placed the 2 candles on a nearby table and sat. "That's preposterous!" Colin shouted. Curious, Emma turned around and wandered over to the open laptop as she mulled over Catherine's oddly specific knowledge of the Georgian terraced houses. Perhaps Catherine or one of her relatives lived in one of those houses. As she reached the open laptop, Emma stared at the screen, a smile spread across her face. Chapter 4. A brewing development. Hovering over Catherine's table, Emma positioned her fingers on the built-in trackpad. On the screen wasn't an academic paper about the architectural history of Bath Abbey. Instead, it was a meticulously crafted email highlighting Colin Pembroke's systematic dismantling of a few of Bath's historic homes, complete with photographs that wouldn't look out of place in a property developer's portfolio. Its contents didn't reflect a "how dare he" moment, but more of an "I can't believe he beat us to the punch" theme. It was sent to Howard Marsh at an Ashford and Marsh email address. She cast her eyes over the email on the screen one last time. So Emma wasn't losing her mind to the menopause. The last name did sound familiar. Ashford and Marsh were one of the biggest property developers in London and owned the renovated Edwardian mansion block where she lived. Ashford and Marsh had converted the Edwardian home into 9 1- and 2-bedroom flats, gutting the interior and modernising it, then charged a small fortune in rent. They must be attempting to conquer Bath and have a rivalry with Pembroke Properties. The bitter scent of almonds and Earl Grey mingled with the metallic tang of the storm as rain lashed against the Georgian windows. Thunder rolled overhead and lightning flashed across the sky, far off in the distance. The storm was on the move, searching for the next town to terrorise. Scrolling through the long email trail, Emma gasped as her eyes cast over a familiar name, Peggy Bradford. The passage read, "At the Bath Heritage Watch meeting, Peggy Bradford, who is also the chair of the organisation, compiled extensive evidence of developer Colin Pembroke's systematic targeting of elderly property owners in Bath's vibrant city centre area, and is in the process of compiling a document on Ashford and Marsh. She has also made several trips to London, talking to our former homeowners. Someone needs to stop this woman." Emma froze. Either of those property developers could have poisoned Mrs. Bradford. Both of them had motive and opportunity. Catherine had access to Peggy's tea, while Colin had access to the sugar. Still, the murder made little sense for either suspect. A vital piece of the puzzle remained at large. According to the email between Catherine Ashford and Howard Marsh, Colin was well versed in charming and manipulating elderly residents out of their properties. Also, he seemed like the type to throw more money at a problem resident like Peggy. In a certain light, one could see his actions that way, like getting her sugar and the hushed conversation. Poisoning someone seemed more like an act of desperation. Colin didn't seem desperate, especially given his obviously bespoke suit. Emma had sat through enough board meetings to recognise the telltale signs of Savile Row tailoring. The perfect shoulder line and hand-stitched lapels were unmistakable. Perhaps the secret to solving Peggy's murder lay in what happened after her death. If that was all about securing Mrs. Bradford's property, killing her would tie up the estate. That would leave the property developers to start all over again with whoever inherited Peggy's terraced house. It would also allow other developers to swoop in and present an offer to the family. Holy crapes! Perhaps Catherine wanted to stop Peggy from looking into Ashford and Marsh and brought the poison to the tea room. It had to be close by, allowing her to drop it in Peggy's tea. After that, the vial vanished. Things didn't simply vanish into thin air, so technically the vial must be in the tea room somewhere. Emma gasped. It was a two birds, one stone scenario. The more she considered the evidence, the clearer the picture became. Yet Colin's decision not to throw Catherine under the bus seemed peculiar. She was the Ashford in Ashford and Marsh. As a business owner in a cutthroat industry, he should have been familiar with his rival. Maybe he'd met only Howard Marsh and didn't know Catherine. That would explain the lack of finger-pointing along with his seemingly genuine belief that Violet had poisoned Peggy because she had access to the kitchen. Emma's chest tightened. She needed to call the police without raising Catherine's suspicions. As she ran through several excuses for her to leave the tea room, a sharp, thin piece of metal dug into her back. "Find something interesting?" Catherine asked haughtily. Her strong perfume floated in the air, making Emma's eyes water. She could barely breathe. Emma froze. The room had gone silent apart from the storm outside, and she hadn't noticed. With no other choice remaining, Emma faced the reckless decision to confront a killer, hoping to distract Catherine while someone slipped away to call the police. She straightened her frame as she had in countless meetings, channeling that same confidence and command. Actually, yes. Backed against the table, Emma faced Catherine, who had taken a step back, butter knife in hand. It had no serrated edge. A butter knife couldn't do much damage, especially wielded by Catherine's slender arms. The light, blunt instrument posed little threat, though Catherine's wild-eyed determination suggested otherwise. "When I heard your last name, it sounded familiar, but I couldn't figure out why. And now I know. You're no historian. You're the Ashford in Ashford and Marsh." "Sorry," Colin muttered, and a hint of surprise lingered in his voice. His hand fell away from Violet's arm as he stepped back. His earlier confidence dissolved like sugar in a freshly poured cup of tea. "You're a part of Ashford and Marsh? But Howard and I are drinking buddies. He told me that the company had this old family heritage." The man was clueless. Perhaps property development was still a man's world. "I'm a historian," Catherine snapped. "Both things can be true. I formed Ashford and Marsh a year after I finished my PhD with my husband, Howard Marsh. There's more money in it." "So it's about the money." Emma narrowed her eyes. "You're not at all concerned about the trips Peggy made to London and the discussions she was having with Ashford and Marsh's former clients?" Catherine rolled her eyes. "Oh, you remember the elderly homeowners you swindled out of their properties." Catherine lowered the butter knife and laughed. "That's all you have? A wild conspiracy theory about my company buying homes at market value from elderly residents." "As if you bought them at market value." Emma peered down at the open flap of Catherine's shoulder bag. The flap jiggled with Catherine's subtle shoulder movements. "And according to that email to your husband, Howard Marsh, you were worried about the document she was compiling on you? Or we could talk about why Ashford and Marsh have moved out of the London property market and into Bath." Emma grimaced. That makes no business sense. Despite the current economic situation, staying in a bigger market makes more sense. Why would you willingly move to a smaller market? Catherine scoffed. "What do you know about the current economic climate? You're just some boring housewife filling her empty, boring life lunching with friends." Emma clenched her jaw as those words swirled around her mind. The last thing she needed was to lose her cool and get sidetracked. She took a few deep breaths in through her nose and centered herself. "More than you think." Emma cast her eyes on Catherine's bag. "How long were you stalking Mrs. Bradford?" "I guess not very long, because she goes to the Georgian Leaf tea room every weekday afternoon at 3:30. "Now, you're being utterly ridiculous." Emma raised her eyebrows. "But today was different. When you showed up at the tea room, you couldn't believe your luck because Colin Pembroke was here, probably wanting to check out the tea room and start pressuring Violet into selling, so you continued with your plan." Emma studied Catherine, whose face was pale and expressionless. Catherine must have been trying not to react. To a certain degree, she was quite successful. "Now I know why you were taking photos of the tea room's interior. You're not just sightseeing, you're documenting another acquisition target." Violet glanced over at Colin. "Both of you." You walked past Peggy's table with a vial of cyanide in your hand, intending to pour it into her teacup while you asked for directions to the ladies' room. In the bathrooms, you threw the vial into the bin, returned to the tea room, and waited. When we discovered Peggy's unfortunate ending, you threw Colin under the bus, distracting me from asking him about his conversation with Peggy. Colin's face darkened. You're letting me take the fall for this. I backed out of the development because a few residents refused to sell, and the council created a ton of red tape, turning the development into a real faff. You would have known about it because I discussed it at length with Howard. Catherine's posture stiffened, and her perfectly manicured fingers trembled as she reached for her bag. You can't prove any of this. Jenny gasped. I'm going to check the bathrooms. She jumped up, ran through the tea house, and disappeared into the entrance hall. See, it wasn't me. I'm innocent. Resisting the urge to roll her eyes at Colin, Emma reached behind her, grabbed a napkin from Catherine's table, and lunged forward. With a napkin in hand, Emma pulled back the flap of Catherine's black shoulder bag. Catherine jerked her shoulder away, but Emma had a tight grip on the flap of the handbag. As they struggled, the bag's contents spilt onto the floor. Scattered before Emma was a square zippered purse, one of those expensive key wallets, a USB stick, lipstick, an Ashford and Marsh business card with Catherine's name on it, and an empty vial with a cork-style lid. Catherine hadn't thrown out the vial. Instead, she'd expected to walk from the tea room with the murder weapon, an arrogance Emma couldn't comprehend. Then she realised that Catherine had to leave with the vial because she hadn't used gloves. As sirens wailed in the distance, Catherine crouched on her hands and knees, frantically stuffing items into her bag. Emma wandered into the open area between the tables, blocking her path to the exit. Tyres screeched against the cobblestone road as the sirens came to an abrupt halt. Car doors slammed as Catherine's shoulders slumped. It was as if she had already given up hope of evading arrest. 2 police officers appeared through the tea room's front windows, then disappeared. A few moments later, they entered, their rain-soaked uniforms dark against the Georgian wallpaper. For the next 30 minutes, the police took everyone's initial statements. Catherine's posture collapsed as the handcuffs clicked into place, the sound echoing through the tea room like the final notes of a tragic sonata. Her carefully constructed historian's facade disintegrated like a derelict building, revealing the desperate property developer beneath. Through the Georgian windows, police lights painted the cobblestones in alternating patches of blue and red, each flash illuminating puddles that mirrored the historic facades, a modern intrusion into the preserved pocket of Bath. The late afternoon storm cast elongated shadows across the floorboards as Catherine was led away. Her arrogant demeanour crumbled like aged tea leaves. She hunched forward with her hands cuffed behind her back, and a female police officer guided her into the entrance hall and to the police car that was parked at an angle, blocking vehicle access to the street. The empty vial sat on the oak table like a prop from a period drama gone wrong, its delicate glass catching the last remnants of stormlight. A rock formed at the pit of Emma's stomach as she turned her gaze to Mrs. Bradford's abandoned table, where a half-finished cup of tea marked her final moments. The elderly woman's regular afternoon ritual, a cornerstone of the Georgian Leaf's daily rhythm, had become an unwitting last act. Outside, tourists huddled under shop awnings, smartphones raised like modern-day torches. In a few moments, the Georgian Leaf would be social media fodder, transforming the tragedy into another Bath curiosity. The remaining tea service sat abandoned, steam no longer rising from the porcelain cups. A tall rugby player-sized police officer towered over Colin, his notebook poised like a judge's gavel. The tension between them crackled like static electricity before a storm. Each word of Colin's statement seemed to increase the officer's scepticism, his eyebrows inching higher until the inevitable request came for Colin to assist with further inquiries at the station. Colin's afternoon was about to become considerably longer. The familiar clink of china against china drew Emma's attention as Violet appeared at her elbow, 2 fresh cups of tea steaming in her trembling hands. The scent of green rose tea wafted between them, like a gentle reminder that some comforts remained unchanged, even as their world had shifted beneath their feet. "Well," Violet said, her usual polished tone wavering slightly, "this wasn't the afternoon tea we'd planned." She paused, blinking back tears. "I can't believe I'll never see Mrs. Bradford perched at her regular table again, tutting over the proper way to serve Earl Grey. It's just—" She swallowed hard, unable to find the right words. Emma accepted the offered cup, wrapping her hands around its warmth. The familiar ritual of afternoon tea felt like an anchor in choppy waters, a reminder that even amid tragedy, some traditions endured. Outside, the storm was finally moving on, like Catherine being led away to face justice, leaving behind a tea room forever changed by one fateful afternoon of tea and betrayal. Epilogue. A final pour. Tea leaves swirled in the final dregs of Emma's almost empty teapot. She closed the lid and gazed out the window from her usual table by the fireplace in the Georgian leaf. Outside, the afternoon crowd hurried past under their umbrellas, shopping bags carried close to their chests. A week had passed since Mrs. Bradford's murder. Still, traces lingered. Violet had hired a new staff member to man the front counter and hovered like an anxious mother hen whenever a new customer entered the tea room. The autumn rain returned with a vengeance, transforming the cobblestone street into mirrors reflecting the grey sky above. Inside, warmth from the antique gas radiators mingled with the aroma of freshly baked scones and sweet raspberry jam. A young couple occupied Mrs. Bradford's former table, completely unaware of its history as they debated the merits of Earl Grey and English breakfast. Peggy would be tutting in her grave at their indecision, not to mention appalled if they chose English breakfast. Emma turned her attention to Violet's light blue and white spotted cup and a matching teapot of Earl Grey waiting patiently on the other side of their table. It was probably getting cold. "Are you thinking about Mrs. Bradford?" Violet emerged through the open double doors near the counter with a fresh pot of green tea for Emma, balanced on a serving tray. She had swapped her usual elegant black dress for heels, tailored black trousers, and a cream cashmere blend woolen jumper that probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent. But there was something different about her. The tension she carried in her shoulders since Emma's previous visit had vanished. "I can barely glance at that table without tearing up. The tourists must think I'm mad." Violet placed the blue floral teapot on the table and sat. The detective inspector called this morning. She poured tea into Emma's cup, filling it to just below the rim. "Remember how cute he was in that uniform? I could give him your number." She winked. "You know I've sworn off men." Emma shook her head. Violet chuckled. "Just because my brother is a dingleberry, that doesn't mean they're all bad. You need a handsome younger man. It will drive him bananas." Emma wrapped her hands around the sides of her teacup. "So, did they find anything interesting on Catherine's laptop?" Fascinating change of topic. Violet smiled. "They found evidence linking Ashford and Marsh to similar schemes around Somerset. It turns out that Mrs. Bradford wasn't their first target, just their first mistake." Violet picked up the teapot and her pale blue and white spotted teacup and poured herself a second cup of Earl Grey. And their most public one. Emma pursed her lips. "Did they get Colin Pembroke too?" "Not yet." Violet leaned back in her chair. "But the detective inspector said it's only a matter of time. Apparently, Colin has quite the reputation for acquiring historic properties through questionable means." She shrugged. At least the Georgian leaf is safe. Howard Marsh confessed everything, hoping for a reduced sentence, including the part where his wife dressed up as an academic and went around poisoning elderly residents who wouldn't sell. Emma raised her eyebrows. No, Violet waved dismissively. But he admitted to running elaborate schemes to pressure historic property owners into selling, and he had a spreadsheet detailing every property gained over the last decade, complete with purchase prices that were well below market value. It's odd that he confessed. Emma furrowed her brow and nodded. I wonder if the police played the same trick on him as they did on Catherine. They could have led him to believe they already knew, so he caved and confessed when he should have called his lawyer. The rain had transformed into a drizzle, leaving puddles scattered along Abbey Street. Tourists huddled under clear dome-shaped umbrellas bearing Vector-style Bath-themed illustrations. An elderly woman with a familiar shoulder-length grey bob and a fringe hobbled past the window. For the briefest of moments, Emma's heart stopped. Then she remembered. Peggy was gone. Beside the woman was a girl with long hair, wearing yellow rain boots and a matching parka with a hood. The little girl jumped into a puddle, splashing the elderly woman and causing her to gasp. I still can't believe Catherine and Colin were after my tea room. Violet placed her hand on the table. I could have lost this place. You saved my family's legacy. Emma took a sip of her tea. Actually, Mrs. Bradford saved it. If she hadn't been documenting what was happening, I wouldn't have figured it out. She must have known they were coming for the Georgian leaf. Or maybe she warned you because the building was from a similar time period to her house. Yes. Violet ran her hand down the front of her cashmere jumper. She moved into her terraced house in York Street during the 60s. This was her local tea room. She loved the tea room and believed it was a living thing with a history worth protecting. Violet stared out the window. After Colin made her an offer, she came to warn me about both developers. Peggy left a note for me by the cash register. In that letter, she said they were circling like vultures. The police found it after the arrests. Emma sighed. That was probably what she meant by foul things are afoot. That's not all, Violet leaned in conspiratorially. The detective inspector found Mrs. Bradford's notes hidden under her floorboards. They weren't just about Bath. She had evidence of property schemes from their time in London. Violet shook her head. Ashford and Marsh had purchased all those historic buildings for a fraction of their worth. They turned them into soulless modern apartments and boutique hotels. Mrs. Bradford wanted to prove it was all connected. And now she has, even if she's not here to see it. Emma glanced at the young couple sitting at Mrs. Bradford's table. The woman lifted the lid of the blue and white china teapot and peered inside. Rain tapped against the window as Emma finished her tea. Tourists huddled under the eaves of the shop across the street, clutching maps. Locals hurried past with shopping bags, paying no mind to the drama that had unfolded a week ago. You know, Emma set down her cup. A month ago, I thought my life was over. Now, I'm waiting for the rug to be pulled out from under me. I'm not sure if I can still keep working at Bite Tech with Stephen. He's ruined my dream. She shook her head. What am I going to do? Violet reached across the table and squeezed her hand. But aren't you the majority shareholder? Emma shrugged. Yes, me and the board. Stephen conveniently bought shares from the members of his boys' club who had left, but he'll never have the majority. When Bite Tech went public, to create the public offering, they created more shares by dividing the existing ones in half. The majority of shares for the public offering were taken from the board. It was their idea. A few were taken from me, but I still have the majority stake. I should get back to London, Emma said, gathering her coat. I have a meeting with my lawyer tomorrow. Stephen is already trying to negotiate the prenup. You'll come back, though? Violet asked. For tea? I'll keep in touch. Stephen can't stop me." Emma stood, put on her wrap coat, and tightened the fabric belt around her waist. "You and I were friends first, after all." As she stepped out into the rain, Emma felt lighter somehow. She had solved a murder, brought justice for Mrs. Bradford, and rediscovered a strength that she thought she'd lost a month earlier. The betrayal still stung, and she had a long road ahead of her, but whatever came next, she was ready. For the first time in perhaps a decade, she craved something different. It gnawed away at her, but it was swallowed up by fear, uncertainty, and heartbreak. Emma dismissed it because the wound from the betrayal was still fresh. Thank you for listening to A Fatal Steeping, an Emma Warwick mystery short story, written by Amelia D. Read to you by Beth, an AI synthetic female voice. Copyright 2025. All rights reserved.